Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages good discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Kevin Quinn. Our special guest is Christine Brennan, considered the country's most widely read female sports journalist, and we're to discuss her career and the world of sports through her lens. Christine, welcome to the program.
Hey, Kevin, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, you are widely known, as I just said, but maybe there's some folks out there that don't quite know what you do. So tell us a little bit about who you work for and what you do.
Well, I'm very lucky, Kevin. I get to do what I love as my career, and I love it more today than the day I started way back here in the Midwest in Northwestern University. I graduated in 80 and 81 from Northwestern, undergrad and master's degree. And now I am USA Today's national sports columnist. I'm ABC News sports consultant contributor, so I'm on Good Morning America, World News, Nightline, This Week, the Stephanopoulos Show. I work for NPR. I worked for ESPN for many years over the various Olympics and what have you. And I do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of, as I said, TV work, and of course, newspaper work is I'm still, of course, the big thing I do. My foundation really is USA Today, so I feel very fortunate to have all these different things, and but have been in the business for quite a while. Washington Post, Miami Herald, before USA Today.
Well, you've been a beat reporter and you've been a columnist. So I think, being a columnist, you get to offer your opinions a little bit more, or at least more obviously.
Sure.
So talk a little bit about what the difference is between those two kinds of jobs.
Kevin, I think it is very different, and you kind of graduate to be a columnist, I think. I talk to students quite a bit around the country, and they say, oh, I want to be a columnist. And I say, well, write for 15 or 20 years and then come back and talk to me. It's to find your voice, to give your opinion, to feel comfortable and confident enough, frankly, to give that opinion. I think that's a big part of what I do now. And so I've been writing columns for USA Today since 1998, I guess it was, and I really feel that with all the national issues out there in sports, it's just it's been an amazing run, and I love it. And as I said, I'm still enjoying doing it. So whereas as a journalist, as a beat writer, a reporter, it's the old just the facts, ma'am. What you learn in journalism school. Obviously, as a columnist, it's the complete opposite. The facts, of course, are important. Although some of the emails I get, those people would say maybe I don't base it on fact, but I do, and I certainly do my best. And then I jump off from that to give an opinion. And interestingly enough, USA Today and so many other media outlets, I think, are craving, frankly, Kevin, that opinion. We're finding on the internet, people know automatically what happened in the game. They know the score. They know what happened often before the 11 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news if it's Central Time Zone. And so what they want is analysis, opinion. For example, at the Sochi Olympics, every day I was writing at every event a 300-word column, a quick hit, immediately to get it online. 9-hour time difference. If it's 9 o'clock at night at Sochi, it's noon in Eastern Time, United States. Everyone is going off to lunch and quickly wants to read what's going on. So there's much more of a premium, I think, now being placed on opinion, quick hit analysis, and personally, I love that. That just plays right to, I think, what I love to do the most, of course, in this internet age.
I mean, with that comes some danger, because sometimes I know how I feel about not even just sports stories, but political stories or other cultural things. Sometimes your initial reaction when you have sort of part of the information about it, I wouldn't not necessarily want my thoughts to be in print forever because I revise those after a while. So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's a great point. And any young journalists who are listening to us out there, I would caution you that to take that beat, take a minute, take 30 seconds, take whatever you can get, and do step back and just think about it. I think because I've been doing this for quite a while, that maybe it's ingrained in me now to have that beat inside of me, to take that step back. But I'll give you a perfect example. The Jameis Winston story, the Heisman Trophy winner. But as that was all playing out, and he hadn't yet won the Heisman, of course, you've got the authorities finally, belatedly, starting to look into very serious allegations, of course, of rape, sexual assault. And there was a press conference, and it was the state's attorney, Willie Miggs, and he's kind of joking and laughing, and reporters are laughing, and I'm watching this on television. I'm not at it. I'm not covering it. I'm watching it at home. And my editor called and said, "Can you give me a quick column on this? Are you watching this?" Because it was, to his mind and my mind, a total embarrassment. Unbelievable that people are laughing and joking and treating allegations of rape so lightly. My editor said, "Can you give us the 300 words now?" Now at this point we hadn't even really discussed what our plan was, but can we get these 300 words as quick as you can get it to us? I said, "No, I'm going to wait till the end of this press conference. Here's why. I'm from the North. This is Tallahassee, Florida. I've lived in Miami for 3 years. I know Florida. I don't want to have any preconceived notion as a Northerner about a Southern sheriff, a Southern law enforcement person. I want to wait and have this whole thing play out, and then I will give you the 300 words." So it was probably 20 minutes later. That 20 minutes can be a lot on the internet, in our quick hit internet world. But for me, that was essential to hear the whole thing and to make sure that I was seeing what I thought I was seeing, and to make sure that the tone didn't change. And I think, again, for any young person out there that is thinking of journalism, it's okay to say back to your editor, I need a couple more minutes because I have to make sure I'm right about this. If I go and blast away, and then it turns out that it becomes very serious, it turns out, sadly, this one did not become serious, and it played right into all the stereotypes, unfortunately, and I did write that column, very critical, of course, of that whole scene.
Well, that might be something that you learned at Northwestern. You obviously got an outstanding journalism education. But I read that you didn't cover sports at Northwestern. Is that right?
That is correct, Kevin. And I never did, which maybe Northwestern wasn't very good in sports back then, so maybe that was preparing me for by not covering it, I then could go on to cover sports when I got out. I'm obviously making fun. Northwestern's gotten very good in a lot of sports, and of course academics is still incredibly strong. I'm very proud of that. But yes, so I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, as probably the biggest girl jock in Ohio, maybe in the Midwest, maybe in the country, who knows. And I'm 6 feet tall now, basically 5'11" and a half. My mom joked I was born size 6X and kept right on growing. And so I played sports like crazy. My dad, I'm the oldest of four. There was not older brothers. It was my dad and me. My dad was my own personal Title IX, as it turned out, a rock rib Republican, and yet the biggest feminist I ever knew. So we learned early on to take stereotypes and throw them out the window in our household. And so played sports, loved sports. We had season tickets for the Detroit Tigers, Toledo Mud Hens, AAA team of the Tigers, our hometown team, Michigan football, Toledo football. I mean, I couldn't get enough of it. So now you're saying, okay, wait a minute. So all the sports, playing it, loving it, watching it, trading baseball cards, you name it, and I wasn't doing sports at Northwestern. What's that about? Well, again, I started when I went through high school. I was a six-sport athlete basically in high school. I was lucky enough to be the senior athlete of the year in my high school, and once I got a chance to play, because there weren't girls' sports the way there are now, of course, thanks now to Title IX. But anyway, I go to Northwestern. I had never had a female role model that I could look to. I never read a woman's sports byline. Until I got to Northwestern. Never saw a woman on TV doing sports except Phyllis George, who'd been Miss America 1971. That was, if you take one look at some of the pictures of me back then, that was not going to be my career path as Miss America. So that, although Phyllis has become a friend and a great mentor, but at the time, what I had no one I could look to and say, oh, I can do what she's doing someday. So I learned early on the power of role models, the power of seeing someone who looks like you and letting you have that ability to dream and think that you could be there someday. And I vowed probably early in my career, frankly, to be the role model that I never had and to work very hard to encourage young women and men, but especially young women, to get in the business because I never really had that. But politics I love. My father was very involved with politics. And so I just thought, well, I'll just start covering the news around Northwestern, and so I covered congressional races and other political stories and just general news. If there were big speakers who came to campus, I reported on that, and I think that was actually great training. I knew sports. I didn't need to learn sports. I needed to learn journalism. And I've often said, and many of us who came out of Northwestern, a lot of us are, of course, sports journalists now around the country, have said that we are journalists who happen to cover sports. We were ready really to cover anything. And I'm very proud of that. And I think if you look at my columns and you see how much I deal with steroids or terrorism, whether it's Michael Sam, whether it's, oh my goodness, all the bullying issue with the Dolphins, any number of things that I've dealt with, it's really, they are issues that have transcended sports. And that Penn State story comes to mind, again, Lance Armstrong, where it's a sports story, but it's so much more than sports. And I've gravitated to those now at this point in my career, but it really goes all the way back to Northwestern and those early days of not covering sports, but covering what you might call really important news, even though sports has obviously become really important news in our country.
It is, I mean, partly because it's so much money. One of the things I find interesting about sports is that it, in some ways, it's microcosm of society. We can have ethical discussions sitting on the bar stool or at the bowling alley or in line at the bank or whatever, with folks that are kind of non-threatening because they're about sports. But yet, what's fair, what's not, what's wrong, what's not right. And of course, we go back to not just women in sports, but the race issues in sports. It's hard to imagine what this country would have been like had it not been for Jackie Robinson and how that went down. How the integration, of course, the military that came before that, or started to come before that, but it's still happening. I mean, you talk about Michael Sam, and the whole idea of steroids and what's fair, what's not fair, what's fair competition and what's not. So I do have to ask you this: you're the first woman sports reporter at the Miami Herald.
That's correct.
Okay, I mean there may have been a few others, but maybe not at a major newspaper like that. So you're a young lady at the time, right? I mean, you're not. You're not a grizzled veteran or anything like that. And you walk into this world.
Yes.
I mean, what's more male than the sports journalism world? So
Nothing.
What was that like? What was that like?
Well, my first locker room experience, going into the men's locker room, and people may even say, why do you have to do that? Well, that's where we do our interviews. That's where we do our job. So if you're a reporter, if you're a journalist, you're covering sports, a game, you have to go in the locker room. Going back to 1980, this was not standard fare back then. There were still, as you said, there were very few women. I had some role models, some women who were a few years ahead of me who actually were out doing that. But there was no internet, so I didn't get a chance to be in touch with them. There was no email. I didn't know, I knew their names, but I didn't know how to reach them or talk to them. So 1980, I'm 22 years old. I'm an intern at the Miami Herald. I'm going to be covering, doing a sidebar on the Vikings. Minnesota Vikings are playing down against the Dolphins in a preseason game. So my assignment is to write about the Vikings. Well, that means I have to go in the Vikings locker room. I've never been in a men's locker room before, so I call back to Toledo, Ohio, Mom and Dad, get them on the phone. I said, Dad, do you have any advice for me? And he said, honey, keep eye contact at all times. So to this day, that's my story. I'm sticking with it. What do I see? The whites of their eyes. I've probably been in 700 locker rooms, 1,000. I don't even know. Although I haven't been in many recently, just because the Olympics, there's no locker rooms. Of course, that's for security reasons. That has nothing to do with male, female, anything other than security. Golf, tennis, no locker rooms. The individuals come to us, of course, but in the press room. But yeah, when I went in that locker room, the Vikings that day, there were whoops and hollers. I could. Nameless, faceless guys somewhere way over in the corner, screaming, we don't come in the women's bathroom, what are you doing here? But this is 1980. I mean, we are now talking ancient history. And covering college football in Miami, I was in the Miami Hurricanes locker room every day when they won the national title in '83. So that notion that some of these macho guys had back then that, if a woman comes in the locker room, she's going to ruin the atmosphere. Well, the first locker room I was in every day was the Miami Hurricanes, the year they won the first national title. That was before Miami was Miami. And they, of course, then cemented that with that first national title. Miami Dolphins, Don Shula told his players to have robes. I would be in there. Several other female reporters as well would be in there. And now, of course, thankfully, it's all settled. 1985 was the last time the National Football League, the other leagues had already done it, the NFL in 1985, issued an edict. All locker rooms had to have equal access. So that's almost 30 years.
I remember a last stand happening in Cincinnati, sort of. That was the last.
Sam Weich, remember that?
Sam Weich was, and I at the time I remember thinking, I wonder if he's just doing this to sort of motivate his team rather than any sense of moral
outrage or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though, again, and for those out there, and then there have been a couple incidents of New England Patriots behaved terribly with Lisa Olson in 1990, 2010, the New York Jets with a TVS Tecca reporter. And I would say to fans, and I'm sure there's someone listening to us right now saying, well, yeah, what are those women doing in that men's locker room? A couple thoughts for you. If you love your Packers, you love your whoever you cheer for, and odds are there's going to be a woman covering the team for TV, for the internet, for the newspaper, whatever. And if she's not allowed to go in that locker room, she can't get the information for you. She cannot give you the quotes and the facts and the information, the analysis that you want as a fan. So you are deprived as a fan. Obviously, there are over 1,000 women covering sports now in this country. I'm very proud of that. I work very hard to encourage young women to do this. And so the notion that you're going to have more and more women coming all the time. Picture that all those girls playing soccer in your neighborhood, some of them are going to be sports journalists. And so they're coming, and that's number one. That's why you do it. Also, men's locker rooms open to women. Women's locker rooms are absolutely open to men's, and I would be the first person to stand out there with a male reporter if he were not allowed into a women's Final Four locker room or some other women's locker rooms. They all are. Of course, women have always been accepting of male reporters because they are so happy to have the coverage, because they get so little coverage compared to men's sports. And bottom line is, what have we heard except for 2 incidents, over the last almost 30 years, Kevin? We've heard nothing. Thousands, tens of thousands, probably 100,000 locker room entries now by women into men's locker rooms. No problem. Every day, every night is happening throughout the summer, every major league team, NBA playoffs, you name it. And the bottom line is the players want us there. They want us to do our job. And these guys grew up with their sisters playing sports right next to them. This is not unusual to see women around sports the way it was for their fathers or their grandfathers.
I mean, the current athletes, they don't remember a time when that was not the norm. I'd like to kind of go back before that was the norm. You wrote a foreword for a book by Billie Jean King. Really, I encourage folks to go look that up if they have a chance. But you talk there very passionately about what the Battle of the Sexes was all about. And I hate to say that, but I suspect that there's some younger folks out there that may not know what that was. So talk a little bit about what that was, where you were, and how that affected you.
Well, this was September of 1973, and Title IX had been signed by Richard Nixon in June of 1972. So we're just a year after that, and basically most universities and high schools were ignoring Title IX, and did for a good 10 to 12, 15 years even. But you've got women's sports are now starting to begin to come of age, and as I say, it was a long process. And here comes the top female player in the world is Billie Jean King at that point. 55-year-old Bobby Riggs was not the top male player in the world. He was well past his prime. He was one of these, kind of a huckster, a shyster, a PR guy, funny guy. He called himself a male chauvinist pig. And this was back in the days when there was still this kind of, I guess there still is a little bit, as we see it in many ways in stories and news, but a kind of men versus women. What's a woman's place? Should she be stay at home in the kitchen? I know that a lot of people are probably saying, what? Yeah, but back then these were serious, and there's nothing wrong with that. Whatever a woman wants to do, obviously the choice is hers, hopefully. But back then, there were a lot of moms, stay-at-home homemakers, that was whatever. Billie Jean King is saying, hey, I'm fighting for women to have equal pay in tennis and have the opportunity to play sports, and Title IX is whatever. So you got Bobby Riggs kind of from the old school and Billie Jean's new school. And Bobby had played a woman named Margaret Court and beat her. She was the #1 player at that time in the world, and beat her easily. Mother's Day of that year, Mother's Day Massacre is what they called it. Billie Jean said, I guess I knew at that point I had to take him on, and I had to beat him and just kind of quiet him down and get rid of him. Now Bobby Riggs, really, I'm smiling as I say it because he really was not a bad guy, but he was just one of these kind of carnival barker types, and he was just going to play it for all it was worth. So they meet at the Astrodome. It's on ABC. This is a time when there's really only 3 channels and maybe a couple public stations. So everyone watched. There are not 300 channels. There are 3.
It was a Roone Arledge made-to-order special.
I mean, it was Super Bowl times 100, and everyone was watching. And I'm in high school, and all the girls and the boys are betting each other. Girls for Billie Jean, the boys for Bobby. Anyway, Billie Jean went out and just beat him easily, straight sets, threw her racket in the air. Our whole family, including my dad, everyone, we were cheering because we were for the girl. And Billie Jean beat Bobby Riggs. And I didn't realize then, I realized many years later, that's the first time I ever saw a woman take a man on an equal footing and beat him. And yes, there are people who say it was hokey, it's exhibition, 20 some years apart in age. Who cares? She beat him. And then there was the word, did he throw the match? That's a bunch of malarkey. She beat him. And the next day I see Mike Kelly, my counterpart is our top boy athlete in my grade, and in the locker room, or in the lockers in the hallway. And I looked at him, I said, we won. You know, the girls won. And he slammed his locker and stormed off. And I don't think I'd ever uttered words like that. So it was, for me as a 15-year-old girl in Toledo, in the suburbs of Toledo, it was just, I never realized, I think, until years later how much it meant to me. I've gotten to know Billie Jean. I did work with her on a book. And every time I see her, and I run into her a couple times a year, I always thank her. You know, I said, what you meant to a 15-year-old girl in Toledo, Ohio. And how many other millions of 15-year-old, 14-year-old, 12-year-old, 10-year-old, 18-year-olds were out there cheering for her. It was an empowering moment, and I think it's a huge piece, Kevin, of the history of women's sports, from Title IX through Billie Jean King up to the Atlanta Olympics, London Olympics, et cetera.
Well, it gave her street cred when she started arguing for equal pay for women in the tennis matches.
Exactly.
And it wasn't that long ago that Wimbledon were they the last one to?
They were the last of the four, and it was several years ago. And in fact, Venus Williams, when she spoke about finally I can make equal prize money with the men, Billie Jean was in the box, in the royal box, and looked up to her and thanked her, Billie Jean, for making this possible, which is pretty cool.
That is very cool. And I mean, who knows how things would have gone with Title IX. I mean, eventually something like that would have happened,
Absolutely.
but it might have taken a little bit longer. Talk about your dad being a sort of a feminist, and you wrote a book that was kind of memoir of that, Best Seat in the House. So I'm guessing you drove up Telegraph Road quite a bit to get to the Tigers games from there. So talk a little bit about your dad and what that meant to you.
You know, it's one of those things you look back, and I'm sure many people listening to us would say that too. You know, you appreciate it so much. Although I appreciated the time, I was loving it as a kid. But he's been gone now for almost 11 years, and we would, you know, he was from south side of Chicago, kind of chiseled out of the sidewalks of Chicago. 6 foot tall, broad, great shape, football player, actually played at Drake for a year and had a tryout with the Chicago Bears. Papa Bear Hallis told him to come back next year, get in better shape. A sign of the times, this was after World War II. He was in the war at the end of World War II and in the occupation of Germany. Comes back, tries out, doesn't make it, and Papa Bear says, come back next year, give it a try. And my dad actually could make more money in business than he could in the NFL, so he never went back. And became a businessman, a wonderful success, starting from nothing, moving and getting a forklift truck franchise in Toledo, Ohio. And that's why my parents moved there right before I was born, and starting this business and family and what have you. But he did love sports, and how lucky was I, Kevin, I mean, to have this man as my father. When I say Republican, you know, he voted for Goldwater and Dewey and Nixon and you name it, and we were a Republican family. But also much more socially liberal, frankly, than what people might think now with Republican. But totally for it. Like, you're my daughter. You love sports. You want to play sports. Play sports. This was happening in the 1960s. I'm sure people, when I was 8, for example, I asked for a baseball mitt for my birthday. My dad got it for me. What were the neighbors thinking as my dad is teaching me how to throw the ball properly? And by the way, I hope we can take the term throw like a girl and retire that term, because of course now for generations we've been teaching our girls in this country to throw the ball properly. So let's get rid of it. It's a compliment now. But back then in the 60s, girls were kind of pushing the ball.
Right, you stepped with the wrong foot.
Right. And my dad taught me how to fire that ball, get behind, cock my arm, and I don't want to knock over the set here, and throw that ball, throw it. And so this is what I was doing. And my mom and dad couldn't have cared less if this was strange or people wondered what was happening. I loved it. They had a tall, athletic daughter, and they encouraged it. How many millions, probably hundreds of thousands of parents did not do that? So as I said, how lucky was I to have a dad who just said, I don't care if it's a boy or a girl, whatever that kid wants to do. We were raised, frankly, all 4 of us kids, there's 3 girls and a boy, all of us were raised as little people. And we were not stereotyped. And it turned out, obviously, it was the greatest gift I could have ever received from my parents.
You were lucky. I mean, nowadays you have the soccer dads that
Totally,
I mean,
yeah.
they all think they're Vince Lombardi for the ladybugs on the field, but
Exactly.
but God bless them for that.
Yeah, now we have the dads are the chief proponents of Title IX.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
the biggest supporters of Title IX because they want their daughters to have what they had. And again, now we're seeing young women like in their 30s and 40s who did grow up with Title IX. But with me, I'm just on the cusp of that, so I had my dad.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because soccer was not a thing
Oh,
when we were
no one
growing up.
played soccer, yeah.
There was a guy who was a nice guy who was the scoutmaster and an Italian immigrant, and he tried to teach a bunch of us that were baseball and football players to play soccer, and it was disastrous, as you might guess. I'd like to talk about another sport that you've been involved with for a long time, which is figure skating. Mm-hmm. And so you've written, I think, 3 different books about that, and perhaps your interaction with it might be best known for the 2002 scandal. So talk a little bit how you found yourself in the figure skating world, and tell us a little bit about what happened back then, and has skating been cleaned up?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because a lot of my friends do ask that same question, like, what are you doing covering figure skating? Because I obviously was not a figure skater. I mean, we skated around we'd freeze the patio, and the days when somehow the patio would freeze, in Toledo, and then we could skate around. And
It
what
did
happened?
this year.
Yes. Oh, exactly. No, this year you're right. This winter was one for the ages. You're right. But so now I'm covering the Olympics for the Washington Post, and if you are one of the top newspapers covering the Olympics and for a U.S. audience, Summer Olympics, you have to be well-versed in track and field, swimming, gymnastics, diving when Greg Louganis was around. Winter Olympics, you have to know figure skating, just because of the great history. Dick Button, Peggy Fleming, Dorothy Hamill, on and on it goes. So I started covering the Olympics, the Winter Games in '88 in Calgary. And I did cover the Battle of the Bryans and the Battle of the Carmens. These were, great stories. Katarina Witt, Debbie Thomas, Brian Boitano, Brian Orser, good stuff. Started again covering the sport in 1990, go to the national championships, and I'm going, my gosh, there's so much going on in the sport. It is so rich. There's such texture to it. Now, the 92 Olympic trials, this was Christy Yamaguchi, Christopher Bowman. Those who do love skating may remember some of these great names, Paul Wiley, on and on it went. Nancy Kerrigan, Tanya Harding, of course, are coming up at that point as well.
That got some ink.
Yes, there was a little attention on that one. That was 1994, 20 years ago now. And so anyway, I start covering this sport, and then the Tanya Nancy thing happens in '94. And the story is on the front page I'm writing on the front page of the Washington Post every day for 6-7 weeks. That's when I started to do a lot of television work. CNN was just kind of coming into its own. This was really the first big cable TV story, Tanya Nancy. It was about 4 or 5 months before O.J. Simpson and 2 dead bodies. Tanya Nancy, you had a bruised knee that spurred Nancy Kerrigan on to the greatest performance of her life. So you could almost you could really laugh about these clowns, these idiots that attacked her. And so anyway, that happens. TV ratings through the roof. The 6th highest rated show in television history is that women's short program from Lillehammer, Norway, in 1994, February of '94. Last Mash, Who Shot JR, 1 episode of Roots, 2 Super Bowls, Tanya Nancy, forevermore. 48.5 rating. The Super Bowl gets a 40. It's just extraordinary. Now there's more TV sets now, but back then that's ratings. So you got this huge, huge, huge event, and no one has ever done a journalistic look at the sport in a book. So I talked to my book editor. I'd worked on a book with Tracy Austin, the tennis star, and we chatted, and they were jumping out of their seats at the idea, and so that inside edge came from that. I was really, Kevin, expecting a lot of my colleagues from other newspapers around the country to also write books. No one did. So I guess that's another great lesson in life. Go for it. And if you're assuming that the more veteran reporters are going to do this, they didn't. I did. Became a bestseller. Allowed me to go off and do all these things that I'm doing now. I got a book deal for the next book that followed the success. It followed All the Skaters to Nagano. That basically all of that financially followed the success of the first book. So that really let me go off and do USA Today and speeches and everything else I do now. And so yeah, it was just pure luck, being in the right place at the right time, having a story that was so much fun to cover, with so many different interesting aspects, judges, the parents, my goodness, the skating costumes and the controversies about that, the tragic loss of life due to HIV and AIDS, something that now people would say, okay, well, yes, we could talk about that. back in the early 90s, people were not talking about that. And I was able to have a chapter where I really brought out just what a terrible toll HIV/AIDS had taken on the figure skating community, the coaches, the choreographers, obviously the men in the sport who had been just hit so hard by that. So many elements to this. It was a journalist's dream come true.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us.
Kevin, thank
and
you.
Thank all of you. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Until next time, I'm Kevin Quinn. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.